Winter Danger, Chapter 3. Caje and the Indian stared at each other without moving. Caje could feel grass tickle his cheek and some sort of bug crawl over his neck. He could feel the cold metal of his rifle in his hand, but somehow he couldn't pick it up and aim it. And then the brave's hand moved toward the knife at his side. Caje jerked the rifle around then. He brought the barrel up, and without waiting to aim, he pulled the trigger. There was a click, but nothing happened. His rifle had misfired. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He hadn't a chance now. He pulled the trigger frantically 3 or 4 times. The Indian's hand was raised high, the knife poised in the air. Caje saw the savage's mouth spread wide in an expression of hatred and triumph, and flung up his arm to ward off the blow. Something whistled over his head. The Indian gave a grunt of surprise and dropped the knife. Caje saw the blood spurt from the brave's head down over the yellow grass. The Indian swayed and pitched forward. Jared leaped over Caje and brought the butt of his rifle crashing down on the back of the Chickamauga's head. He jerked the Indian's body over and wrenched his tomahawk from the red man's skull. It made a sickening noise. The warrior's fingers twitched convulsively and then were still. Caje stared with horror at the thick, brown fingers lying on the blood-stained grass. Jared hacked at the grass and earth with his tomahawk until it was clean. He slipped it into the thong on his belt and spoke to Caje in a whisper. "Keep down. There's bound to be more of them fellers. We got to get away from here quick afore they find out this'n ain't in such good health." "Pa," Caje stammered. "My rifle. It didn't fire. I pulled the trigger and it didn't fire." "What ails it?" asked Jared angrily. He took the gun and examined it. "Ain't nothing the matter except you ain't picked the flint sharp. Ain't I told you enough? You got to keep it sharp if it's going to make a spark and fire the powder. There's times when I think you're addled in the head." Swiftly, he took a new flint from his shot bag and fitted it into the jaws of the cock. He thrust the rifle back at Caje with an impatient gesture. "It's all right," he said more kindly. "If'n you'd fired a shot, you'd have brought the rest of them Injuns a-running. Keep down now. We got to get out of this grass and up on the mountain afore they come after us." Caje took the gun. His pa was right. He must have been addled to let his flint get dull like that. It must have been worrying over spending the winter in a cave that made him forget to look after his gun properly. He'd give a pretty now to be sitting snug in that cave. He began to crawl after his father. He'd rather stand up and run for it. The other Indians weren't close by, but Jared wouldn't ever run that kind of risk. He didn't seem to mind breaking his back in two and cutting his hands to ribbons. It seemed like hours before the grass began to thin out. Still stooping, Jared ran to some scraggly bushes and from them to an outcropping of rock. Caje followed on his heels, and they crouched together behind the big stones. Jared looked carefully in all directions. "We'll go yonder ways. Keep on the rocks as much as you can and keep out of sight." Caje nodded. He took a deep breath and tried to fill his lungs good. When they got up to the steep part of this mountain, he'd need all the air he could get. They started up the hillside, stooping and half crawling behind rocks, slipping from tree to tree. Caje tried to follow his father exactly. He knew the way Jared went would be the right way, the way that would be hardest for the Indians to spy out and follow. But his legs weren't as long as his father's, and his wind didn't hold out so well. Once his foot slipped on a rock, and he crashed into the calico bushes below. Jared hauled him up by one arm. "That'll leave a nice easy sign for 'em," he snarled. "Can't you keep on your feet? Watch where you're going." Caje rubbed his bruised knees and looked at his father with hatred. He'd never asked to come down here in Chickamauga country, he told himself. If they got scalped, it was none of his fault. A boy had to go where his pa said. Well, there wasn't any use fussing. Here he was, and if he meant to save his neck, he'd best do as his pa told him. Jared would get them out of this, if anybody could. He went on, climbing and scrambling among the rocks. His legs ached with weariness. They came to a creek filled with big rocks. Jared jumped from boulder to boulder, crossing back and forth across the stream. Caje measured each jump as carefully as he could. He wouldn't slip again, but his legs began to tremble with the effort. He had to force himself to make each jump, and it was hard to balance without grabbing hold of trees and bushes. Once Jared let him rest while he climbed a tall tree and peered down into the savannah. "Yonder they be," he called to Caje. "7 of 'em. They've found that feller we spoke to." He climbed down and stood looking around, frowning and pulling at his beard. He took off his pack and Cage's and hid them in a crevice of the rocks. "We can come back and get 'em later," he told Caje. He looked around carefully to be sure he left no signs to show the Indians where the packs were hidden. "Come on," he said finally. "I don't reckon they'll find our trail easy, but I want to get up on top of this mountain quick as we can." They started up again. The wind blew harder than ever. It whipped across Cage's face like a hickory switch, but he hardly noticed. He was busy trying to make his weary legs move him further up the rocks. They climbed for another half-hour. At last they came out on a little overhang of rock, covered with calico bushes and bare huckleberry bushes. "We can stop here," said Jared. "We can see them without them seeing us." Caje threw himself down on the ledge and buried his face in the cool moss. He took in great breaths of air. His legs ached clean up to his shoulder blades. Jared crouched in front of him and looked down into the valley, muttering to himself about the red devils. Suddenly, Jared swore under his breath. "Dang! They've found the place you slipped, Caje. They'll come up that creek sure as shooting. Come on, we got to get away from here," he added sharply. Caje got up. He wasn't panting now, but his legs were numb with tiredness. He checked his rifle carefully this time, and then pushed through the bushes after Jared's retreating back. Jared began to trot, dodging in and out among trees and bushes, stopping now and then to look around, as though he knew just where he was and where he was going. Caje followed as close as he could. Whenever Jared stopped, he stopped too, and leaned on his rifle, trying to give his legs a little rest. Once he called to his father. "Where you headed, Pa?" "There's a place near here I know of. We'll be right as rain there. They'll never find us." He set off again, and Caje followed. His side hurt, and each breath he drew burned his chest and throat. His head swam, and his legs felt so heavy every time he took a step. He thought next time he surely wouldn't be able to lift them. But each time he could. Sometimes it seemed like he was behind, pushing his tired body and heavy legs forward, step by step. They came to a stretch of underbrush, vines and bushes in a matted tangle. Jared stopped and gave a whistle. "We'll leave a trail through thar that'll be clear as spring water," muttered Jared. "But it don't matter. They'd trail us anyway now. We'll be all right once we get where we're going." Caje didn't answer. He just stood there, hassling like a dog. Even Jared was panting, and sweat stood out on his forehead. They plunged into the undergrowth. It wasn't so thick, but the vines were bad. They caught at Cage's feet and tripped him. He hadn't gone more than a few yards before he got a cramp in his leg. He hobbled along still, but the pain got worse and worse, and he couldn't anywhere near straighten his leg. "What's the matter? Can't you keep up?" Jared panted over his shoulder. Caje stopped. "You go on, Pa," he said finally. "You go on. I'll hide here. If'n they find me, I don't care." Jared turned then and looked at the exhausted boy. He waded back through the bushes and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Come on," he grunted, and half carrying the boy, he set off again. "It ain't no use," Caje told himself as his father shoved him on. We can't never make it." There was a shout behind them. "Yonder they come," panted Jared. "It ain't but a little further where I aim to go. Hold on to my belt and I'll help you. We got to run." Caje gritted his teeth and they ran. He gripped Jared's belt, and when he lagged, his father reached back and dragged him on. The blood pounded in his head till he thought his skull would split wide open, and he couldn't see or hear. "Here," Jared gasped. "In here." Caje looked dimly around. In spite of his weariness, his mouth hung open in astonishment. Great, smooth, gray stones, as high as trees, lay scattered all about as far as he could see. Where they lay near each other, almost touching, they made little roads and corridors walled in with rock. Where they lay across each other, they made tunnels and passages of solid stone. Jared pushed him roughly into a narrow corridor between two of the rocks, and they ran along it. The boulders were so close together, their shoulders brushed the sides, slimy with moss and the everlasting seepage of water. The corridor turned sharply. Again, Jared pushed him into a little tunnel. Caje stooped just in time to avoid hitting his head. It was dark, but Jared pushed him on, around a curve, and then there was light ahead of them. "Go on," whispered Jared. They came out in a little recess in the rock. Vines hung over, and bushes grew close around it. If they were careful and lay low, the Indians could pass within a foot of them and never know. Caje fell on the ground and lay there, panting. There was a depression in the rock floor where rainwater had collected. Jared went over to it and drank with his cupped hands. Caje lay, watching him. He was thirsty as a dry spring, but he couldn't, to save him, find the strength to crawl over there to the water. He listened to the rasping sound of his own breathing as his chest pumped up and down. His heart fluttered under his breastbone like a bird with one wing. His side was on fire, and his leg still ached dully from the cramp. By and by his breath came easier, and he didn't feel so all-fired weak. He pulled himself over to the water hole and, ducking his head down, began to drink in great gulps. "Listen," said Jared. "They've got this far." Caje listened. He could hear the Indians shouting to each other. The shouts echoed so among the rocks that it was hard to tell where the savages were. Once they heard feet running right over the ledge of rock that sheltered them. "I don't reckon they'll find us," said Jared. "We didn't leave no footprints. They'll give up and go on off." He gave Caje some of the deer meat he had brought with him. The boy ate it slowly, listening to the sounds of the red men as they ran up and down the stone corridors. Jared and Caje sat for some time against the rock. Caje was glad of the rest, but the noise of the Indians coming so close made him uneasy. Caje sat with his gun across his lap, his head back against the rock, wondering how long it would take the Chickamaugas to get tired and give up. Suddenly, there was a terrific noise all around, and something smacked into the rock by his shoulder. Caje grabbed for his rifle, but something was the matter with his left arm. It felt numb, and warm liquid trickled down it. He'd been shot.